It was one of those unusually quiet nights in the city, where the hum of streetlights and distant car engines were the only sounds to break the stillness. Officer James Doyle had been on patrol for hours, and the exhaustion was starting to show. He shifted uncomfortably in his car, the leather seat sticking to his back as the heat from the engine slowly waned. Normally, he would have been heading home after his shift, grabbing a quick dinner before settling into the comfort of his living room, but tonight, there was something different in the air. The night felt heavy, suffocating even. James had been working as a police officer for nearly 10 years in the same neighborhood, a neighborhood that had long since been forgotten by the city's wealthy elite. It was a place where poverty was an old friend, and desperation, its closest companion. But in all his years on the force, James had seen everything: gangs, drugs, violence, and the invisible people who lived in the cracks, struggling to survive. Yet, for some reason, tonight felt heavier. He could feel the weight of the city on his shoulders, as though it was pressing down on him from all sides. As he cruised down a dimly lit street, his headlights flashed over a figure hunched on the corner of the sidewalk. At first, he thought it was just another homeless person, someone waiting for a meal or some spare change. But as he got closer, his heart dropped. The girl, she couldn't have been older than 18, was trembling, her thin body wrapped in a tattered blanket. Her face, pale and gaunt, was barely visible beneath a mess of tangled hair. She was sitting on the cold, unforgiving pavement, her legs tucked close to her chest as if she was trying to protect herself from the cruel world around her. There was a faint bruise on her cheek, and her eyes, wide and glassy, stared off into nothingness. James didn't even hesitate. He slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just a few feet away from her. He grabbed his flashlight and quickly got out, the chill of the night air hitting him like a wave. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out as he approached cautiously. The girl didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the ground, and she didn't seem to even acknowledge his presence. James knelt down beside her, trying to get a better look at her face. "Hey, it's all right. I'm here to help. What's your name?" She flinched at the sound of his voice, her body jerking slightly. Slowly, her gaze shifted to meet his, and James felt a jolt of surprise at the hollow look in her eyes. It wasn't just fear he saw there, it was something much deeper, something more painful, a rawness that he couldn't quite put into words. "Mia," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My name is Mia." "Mia," James repeated softly, his heart heavy with an inexplicable feeling of sympathy. "Are you hurt?" She looked down at her arms, which were wrapped in the blanket, and nodded weakly. "I'm cold," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm always cold." James knew that the streets in this part of town weren't kind to anyone, let alone someone as young and vulnerable as Mia. But what struck him more than anything was the way she spoke, almost as if she had lost the will to care about anything anymore. There was no anger, no defiance in her voice, just a quiet acceptance of her situation. James had seen this look before in the eyes of those who had given up on hope, and it shook him more than it should have. "All right," he said gently. "Let's get you somewhere warm. I'll take you to the shelter, okay?" Mia didn't respond, her gaze drifting back to the ground. James could see that she wasn't fully aware of what he was saying, her mind seemingly a million miles away. He stood up and offered her his hand, but Mia flinched again, her eyes widening with fear. I'm not going anywhere," she muttered, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders as if it could shield her from the world. James paused, feeling the tension in the air. He didn't want to push her, but he also knew that leaving her here, alone on the street, wasn't an option. "Mia, I don't think you're safe here. You need to come with me," he said, his voice steady but firm. For a moment, it seemed like she would resist, like she might pull away and disappear into the shadows. But then, with a shuddering breath, she slowly reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold and fragile in his grasp. As he helped her to her feet, he noticed the way she winced with every step, as though the very act of standing was an effort. James led her to his car, where he gently helped her into the passenger seat. As he closed the door behind her, he couldn't help but glance at the street corner where she had been sitting just moments before. It was as if nothing had changed, just another night, another person forgotten. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the car, the engine roaring to life as the headlights illuminated the dark road ahead. The drive to the shelter was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional shuffle from Mia. She had wrapped herself in the blanket, her eyes closed as though she was trying to shut out the world. James stole glances at her every now and then, wondering what had brought her to this point. He wanted to ask, but he could tell that she wasn't ready to talk. They pulled up to the shelter, a small building tucked away in a quiet part of the city. It was a place that provided food, warmth, and safety for people like Mia, but James knew it wasn't a long-term solution. Shelters were overcrowded, and the help they offered was limited. He'd seen it firsthand, the constant cycle of people coming and going, never truly getting the help they needed. "All right, Mia," James said softly, unbuckling his seatbelt. "We're here. You'll be safe inside." But Mia didn't move. She just sat there, her eyes staring out the window, lost in her thoughts. James wasn't sure if she even heard him. "Mia," he said again, leaning over to gently touch her shoulder. She flinched once more, but this time, there was a flicker of something deep within her that he could barely recognize. She turned to face him, and in her hand, she held a crumpled piece of paper. It was stained with age, the edges torn and frayed, but there was something important about it. "Can you read this?" she asked, her voice a whisper. James took the paper from her, carefully unfolding it. It was a letter, scratched, hurried handwriting filled with emotion. As he scanned the words, he realized that it was from Mia's mother, written years ago. The letter spoke of regret, of a broken family, and of a hope that one day Mia would understand. It was clear that her mother had tried to reach out, but for reasons he couldn't yet understand, she hadn't succeeded. "Mia," James said, his voice faltering as he looked at her. "I didn't know." Mia didn't respond. She simply stared at the letter, her fingers trembling as she clutched it to her chest. James didn't know what to say next. He felt helpless, unsure of how to fix a life that seemed so shattered, so beyond repair. But one thing was clear to him, Mia was not just another homeless girl. She was a person, a young woman who had been through hell and was now standing at the edge of a precipice, alone. And it was in that moment, as he looked at the piece of paper in his hands, that James realized he couldn't just leave her here. He had to do something. James sat in his car for a moment, staring at Mia as she clutched the letter to her chest, her eyes glazed over as if she were lost in the past. The night had grown colder, the city's relentless hum continuing to surround them, but in the quiet of the car, everything seemed to freeze. James didn't know what to do next. The shelter was still there, a place she could get food and warmth, a temporary refuge from the harsh realities of the street. But as he glanced over at her, the letter crumpled in her hand, he knew that wasn't enough. It wouldn't be enough to just drop her off and walk away. His mind raced. He'd spent years on the force, responding to situations with quick decisions, cold logic, and an unwavering sense of duty. But now, for the first time in a long while, he didn't know what was right. He didn't know what to do for Mia. He had seen people in trouble before, addicts, the mentally ill, the lost. But Mia wasn't like them. She wasn't just another name in the police report, another statistic of the forgotten. Her story was written on her face, etched in the bruises on her skin, and in the way she held that letter, hopeful, desperate, and broken. The shelter was only a temporary solution, and he knew it. It was a place where people went to escape the cold for a night, only to return to the same street tomorrow, facing the same cold winds, the same gang members, the same fight for survival. Mia had been living on the streets for far too long for this to be the answer. She needed more than food and shelter. She needed something to restore what had been taken from her, her sense of self, her trust, and maybe even her hope. But what did he have to offer her? He wasn't a therapist. He wasn't a social worker. He was just a cop, a man who had seen too much to keep the idealism of youth alive. But there was something in him, something deep down, maybe a flicker of the person he used to be, that knew he couldn't let her go like this. He had seen enough people fall through the cracks of the system. He had watched too many disappear into the shadows, and he couldn't let Mia be one of them. "Mia," he said softly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. She didn't respond at first, but he could feel her eyes on him, even if she didn't look up. "I'm not going to let them take you, all right? We'll figure this out." She didn't say anything, but he could see her shiver as if the words had reached her, like a small flicker of light in a dark room. Mia had spent years alone, lost in a world where people walked past her without a second glance, where every attempt to reach out for help had been met with indifference or rejection. She had learned to expect nothing, to trust no one, and to fend for herself in a world that seemed to have forgotten she existed. And now, here was James, offering her something she hadn't had in so long, a glimmer of hope. But that hope was fragile, and Mia wasn't sure if she could grasp it. "What are you going to do with me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if even speaking required too much energy. Her eyes were still fixed on the letter, her fingers nervously rubbing the edges of the paper. "You're just a cop. What can you really do?" The question hit James harder than he expected. She was right, in a way. He was just a cop. He had a badge, a uniform, and the authority to enforce the law. But that didn't mean he had the answers. That didn't mean he knew how to fix the system that had failed her, the system that had failed so many others like her. He could arrest the gang members who preyed on her. He could break up the street fights, take people into custody, and get them off the streets for a night. But none of that would change the bigger picture. None of that would stop the cycle of poverty, of abuse, of neglect, that had led Mia to this point. "I don't know yet," James admitted, his voice soft but steady. "But I know one thing, I'm not going to let you go back out there. Not tonight." For a moment, Mia was silent. The weight of her situation seemed to press on her chest, and she closed her eyes, as if trying to block out the world around her. She didn't ask for this life. She hadn't chosen it. But somewhere along the way, she had been left behind. Left to fend for herself in a city that had no place for her, no love, no compassion. Her mother's letter, the only thing she had to cling to, seemed like an anchor, but also a reminder of everything she had lost. "What if I don't have a home anymore?" Mia asked quietly, almost to herself. "What if she doesn't want me back?" James didn't know how to answer that. He wasn't a therapist, and he certainly wasn't equipped to handle the pain that Mia carried with her. He had seen it before, the brokenness in people who had been abandoned by the ones who were supposed to love them. He had seen it in the eyes of children who had been taken from their families, in the faces of mothers who had lost their children to the system, in the eyes of men and women who had fallen through the cracks and never found their way out. But Mia's story felt different, somehow. It was personal, raw, and real. It wasn't just about homelessness, it was about a shattered family, about a mother's abandonment, and about a girl who had been left to survive on her own. "Mia," he said, his voice steady but filled with compassion. "I can't promise you that everything will be okay. But I can promise you this, you're not alone anymore. And I'm not going to give up on you." Mia looked at him then, her eyes filled with a mix of uncertainty and hope. She didn't know if she believed him. She didn't know if she could trust him. But for the first time in a long while, she felt something stir inside her, a flicker of warmth, a tiny spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way out of this darkness. James didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't just leave her here. He couldn't let her become another statistic, another forgotten face in the crowd. He had to do something, even if it meant stepping outside the lines of what was expected of him. "You're coming with me," he said firmly, starting the car engine. "We'll figure this out together." As they drove off into the night, the lights of the city blurring past them, James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another call for help. This was something more. This was a chance to do something that mattered, something that would change both of their lives forever. But even as the car sped through the streets, James knew that this was only the beginning. What came next would test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. For now, though, all he could do was offer her a place to stay, a warm meal, and the promise that, no matter what, he would be there to help her find a way out. It wasn't much, but for Mia, it was everything. James drove through the dimly lit streets, the hum of the engine blending with the occasional chirp of crickets in the cool night air. Mia sat in the passenger seat, her blanket wrapped tightly around her, her face still pale and tired. The city seemed to unfold in front of them like an endless stretch of concrete and shadows, the lights casting long, cold reflections on the asphalt. James couldn't shake the feeling that the world around them was indifferent to the suffering it housed. Every block they passed felt like a place where people were swallowed up by the cracks in society, where the invisible people, the ones who had no voices, were forgotten. His hand tightened on the steering wheel as he thought about Mia. He had seen too many faces like hers, people who had fallen through the cracks and were left to rot in the gutters of the world. But Mia wasn't just any homeless girl. She wasn't someone who had simply given up or resigned herself to her fate. She was a person with a past, with a family, with dreams and hopes that had been crushed under the weight of abandonment. And he had no idea how to fix that. How could he? He wasn't trained for this kind of work. He was a cop, not a counselor, not a social worker, not someone who knew how to heal the deep scars that ran through her. But there was something in him, something that refused to turn his back on her. Maybe it was the glimmer of hope in her eyes when she first spoke to him. Maybe it was the faint trust she had placed in him, despite all the reasons she had to doubt him. He couldn't let her go back to the streets. Not again. He had to do something, anything, to make sure she didn't slip through his fingers. "Where are we going?" Mia's voice broke the silence, soft and uncertain. She hadn't said much since they left the shelter, and James had allowed the quiet to stretch between them, unsure of what to say. They reached James's apartment complex in the outskirts of town, a modest building that seemed almost invisible among the other structures. The place wasn't much to look at, but it was clean and quiet, a small oasis in a city full of noise and chaos. James parked the car and turned off the engine, the sudden quietness feeling almost strange after the hum of the road. "Come on," he said, getting out and walking around to the passenger side. He opened the door for Mia, and when she hesitated, he held out his hand. She looked at it for a long moment, her face a mixture of hesitation and doubt, but then slowly, she placed her hand in his. The feeling of her hand in his wasn't what he expected. It wasn't just cold from the night air. It was trembling, fragile, as if she were afraid to hold on for fear of being let down. And as James guided her up the stairs to his apartment, he realized just how broken she really was, how much she had been through, how much she had lost. He didn't have the answers, and he didn't know how to fix her, but in that moment, he made a silent vow to do whatever he could to help her heal, to help her find a way back from the brink of despair. The apartment was small, with simple furnishings, a worn couch, a table cluttered with paperwork, and a few pictures on the walls, remnants of a life that felt far removed from the present. It wasn't much, but it was enough for one person. And tonight, it would be enough for two. James walked to the small kitchen area and grabbed a glass of water, handing it to Mia as she stood awkwardly in the doorway. She looked around the apartment, taking in the modest space, as though unsure of what to do with herself. "You can sleep on the couch," James said, motioning to the sofa. "I'll make you something to eat if you're hungry." Mia shook her head, her voice barely audible. "I'm not really hungry." James nodded, understanding. She had probably gone without food for long stretches of time, but food was never really the issue for people like Mia. It was the emotional hunger, the longing for connection, for safety, for someone to care. "All right," he said. "Just let me know if you need anything." Mia nodded silently, and James left her alone in the apartment while he retreated to his small bedroom. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. He was in uncharted territory now, and the weight of the decision he had made earlier pressed down on him. It wasn't just about helping a girl off the street, it was about trying to mend a broken soul, trying to restore something that had been lost long ago. But he didn't know how to begin. He didn't know where to start. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, his thoughts a jumbled mess. He had always prided himself on being able to handle any situation that came his way. But this? This was different. This was personal. And no matter how much he tried to distance himself from it, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mia's pain was now his burden, too. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. The lights were dim in the distance, the streets empty except for the occasional car passing by. It was a quiet night, but the weight of the world felt too heavy. How could he help Mia? How could he fix something so broken? The answer didn't come, and for the first time in a long while, James felt helpless. He turned away from the window and walked back to the living room, where Mia was still sitting on the couch, staring blankly ahead. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he couldn't walk away now. He had made a promise, and it was a promise he intended to keep. "Mia," he said softly, standing in the doorway. "We'll figure this out. Together." The days that followed felt like a delicate balancing act. James couldn't ignore the ever-present weight of responsibility that pressed on his chest every time he looked at Mia. She had become an enigma in his life, a puzzle he couldn't quite solve but couldn't walk away from. Every moment with her was a reminder of how broken the system was, how many people like her slipped through the cracks and never got the help they needed. But more than that, Mia herself was a constant reminder of everything James had sworn to protect when he first joined the force. She was vulnerable, she was lost, and most of all, she had been failed by the very people who should have cared for her. James had been doing everything he could to help Mia adjust to her new reality in his small apartment, offering her warmth and food and a semblance of safety, but things weren't easy. The first few days were the hardest. Mia barely spoke, retreating into herself whenever James tried to engage with her. She would stare out the window for hours, as though looking for someone, or something, that wasn't there. She didn't seem to know how to accept the kindness he was offering her, as if she feared it would be ripped away at any moment, just like everything else had been. For the first time in years, James began to see the world through a different lens. He saw the cracks in the system that had kept people like Mia on the streets, the shelters that were supposed to help but instead treated people like commodities, cycling them in and out of the system without addressing the root causes of their suffering. He saw how broken everything was. How was it that someone like Mia, just a young girl with a shattered past, could end up on the streets in the first place? Why was the city so indifferent to her suffering? Why was it that some people could afford to look away, while others were forced to survive against insurmountable odds? James didn't have the answers, but every time he looked at Mia, every time he saw the hollow pain in her eyes, he was more determined to find them. He knew that taking her in for a few days was a temporary fix, a band-aid on a much larger wound. He didn't want to be just another person who helped for a brief moment and then moved on with their life, leaving her behind. He wanted to be part of the solution. But the road to finding a permanent solution wasn't an easy one. Mia was still reluctant to trust anyone, even James. She was a ghost of the person she once had been, weighed down by the scars of a traumatic past, reluctant to speak about anything that had brought her to the streets in the first place. She had no family, at least, none that she knew of. She had no friends. And the streets had taken everything from her, her innocence, her hope, and her will to believe in anything other than survival. She was a shell of the person she might have been, a young girl turned woman too soon by circumstances she had no control over. But one afternoon, just as James was beginning to lose hope that Mia would ever open up to him, something changed. It started with a conversation, the kind that James had been trying to start for days, but one that always seemed to fall apart before it even began. He had been cleaning up in the kitchen when he heard Mia's voice, small and shaky, coming from the living room. "I don't know where to begin," she said, as if talking to herself, but loud enough for James to hear. He set down the dish he had been washing and walked into the living room. Mia was sitting on the couch, her knees drawn up to her chest, her face drawn in exhaustion. She looked fragile, like the faintest breath of wind could blow her away, but for the first time, she wasn't looking at the floor. She was staring straight ahead, as though seeing something beyond the walls of the apartment, something only she could see. "You don't have to start anywhere," James said gently, sitting beside her. "Just tell me what you're thinking." Mia shifted uncomfortably, her eyes still distant. "I don't even know if I can remember anymore. Everything feels scattered. Pieces of things I used to be, things I used to believe. I don't know where the pieces fit." James swallowed hard. The honesty in her voice was raw, unfiltered. It was the first time she had let him into her world, into the world she had been trying so hard to shut him out of. "You don't have to make sense of it right now," he said softly. "You're allowed to be lost. You're allowed to not have everything figured out." Her eyes flickered toward him then, meeting his for the first time in days, and for a moment, James saw something there. A spark. A flicker of hope, buried deep beneath the surface, trying to break free. It was fleeting, like a firefly in the dark, but it was there. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck?" Mia asked, her voice quiet. "Like you're caught between what you used to be and what you're supposed to be, but there's no way out? Like nothing can change, no matter how hard you try?" James nodded slowly. "I've felt that way before," he said, his voice low. "I've felt stuck. I think a lot of people do. But sometimes, all it takes is finding one person who believes that things can be different, that things can change." Mia's expression softened, but she quickly turned her gaze away, as if the weight of what he said was too much to bear. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore. Every time I've trusted someone, they've either let me down or disappeared. My mom, she disappeared too. And then the shelters, they don't help. They just keep you in a loop, waiting for something that never comes." James felt his heart break at her words, but he kept his composure. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, more firmly this time. "I won't let you down." For a long time, Mia didn't say anything. She just sat there, still and quiet, her hands twisted tightly in the fabric of her blanket. The silence between them was thick, but James didn't rush her. He knew that, for Mia, even the smallest amount of vulnerability was a huge leap. She had been conditioned to push people away, to survive on her own. Letting anyone in was dangerous. Letting someone believe in her was an even bigger risk. But James wasn't going to give up. He couldn't. He had made a promise, and he was determined to keep it. He would show Mia that she didn't have to face the world alone. He would fight for her, even if she couldn't fight for herself just yet. The next few days were filled with more small moments like that. Mia didn't open up all at once, but bit by bit, she began to let down the walls she had spent years building. She started to share pieces of her past with James, fragments of her life before the streets had swallowed her whole. There were stories of a happy childhood, a mother who had once cared for her, and a family that had once been whole. But then there were the darker stories, the things that had forced her to run, to escape, to survive on the streets. And through it all, James listened. He didn't try to fix her. He didn't try to offer solutions. He just listened, offering his presence as a quiet anchor in the storm of her emotions. It wasn't easy. Mia was still guarded, still terrified of letting herself believe in anything. But with each passing day, James could see the change in her. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden transformation. But there was progress. There was hope. And as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift. Mia started to leave the apartment more. She would go to the local library to read, or sometimes, she would simply walk the streets, her eyes alert but no longer lost. She had found a small job at a local coffee shop, serving pastries and coffee to the regulars, and although it wasn't much, it was a start. She was finding her way again, one small step at a time. James didn't ask for anything in return. He didn't need her to change overnight. He just needed her to keep moving forward, even if it was in the smallest of ways. And with each small victory, James knew that they were both getting closer to the life she deserved, one that wasn't defined by the streets, one that wasn't filled with pain and uncertainty. But even as she began to reclaim her independence, James knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Mia would eventually face the painful reality of her past. She would have to make a choice, to confront the demons that had driven her to the streets or to leave them behind and try to build a new life. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks. There would be struggles. But for the first time in a long while, James was certain of one thing: Mia wasn't alone anymore. And no matter what happened next, he would be there to help her pick up the pieces. The mornings had become a little brighter for Mia, and so had the nights. She wasn't the same girl who had stumbled into James's apartment weeks ago. The hollow, fearful expression that had been so prominent when he first met her was slowly fading, replaced with a cautious hope. It wasn't a drastic transformation. There were still days when the weight of her past would come crashing down on her, leaving her retreating into the silence she had once relied on. But with each passing day, she was learning how to navigate the world again. James watched her from a distance, feeling a strange sense of pride mixed with an almost unbearable sadness. Pride, because Mia had shown incredible strength in the face of everything that had happened to her. Sadness, because he knew just how broken she had been, and how long it would take her to heal. But still, the progress was undeniable. Mia had started working part-time at the coffee shop just around the corner from the apartment, a small but welcoming place that smelled like freshly ground beans and warm pastries. At first, it had been difficult. She had struggled to fit into the routine, to adapt to the rhythm of a job, to interact with customers without feeling the walls close in on her. But over time, she had found a sense of purpose there, something simple but important. The regular customers began to recognize her, exchange polite greetings, and slowly, Mia started to take pride in her work. The small victories, the first day she served a coffee without shaking, the first time she smiled at a customer and wasn't immediately consumed by shame, were monumental. But it wasn't just the job that had changed Mia. It was everything around her. James had become a steady presence in her life, the one constant in a world that had always been full of uncertainty. Every day, he offered her encouragement, but never pushed her. He let her take the lead in the small things, allowed her to set her own pace when it came to confronting her past, and never judged her for the things she couldn't change. Yet even with all this progress, James knew the storm was coming. There were still pieces of Mia's life that she hadn't confronted. The trauma that had driven her to the streets wasn't something that could simply be forgotten, nor could it be wiped away with the safety of a job and a warm bed. Mia hadn't spoken much about her mother, only that she had abandoned her when she was still a teenager, leaving Mia to fend for herself. The letter that James had found in her possession, the one she had clutched desperately in her hands when he first found her, was a symbol of everything she had lost. It wasn't just a letter, it was a lifeline. And as much as Mia had tried to bury it, she couldn't escape the fact that her mother was still a piece of her story, whether she liked it or not. James had learned to be patient, letting Mia come to her own conclusions, letting her find the courage to open up on her own terms. But as the days passed, he could see the tension building in her. The uncertainty in her eyes was more pronounced now. It wasn't about whether or not she could survive anymore, it was about what she was supposed to do with the life she had reclaimed. And the thing about reclaiming a life was that it meant facing all the things that had been left behind. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when Mia finally came to him. James had been at the kitchen table, reading through some paperwork from work, when Mia appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment, her eyes scanning the room before finally settling on him. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable, and James felt a lump form in his throat. He knew that look. It was the same look she had worn when she first arrived in his apartment, the look of someone who was trying to decide if they could trust the world again. "Mia?" he asked softly, setting down the papers and looking up at her. He had known for a while that this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it to be so soon. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, her hands nervously twisting the hem of her jacket. She didn't answer right away, and for a brief, terrible moment, James thought she might withdraw again, retreat into the silence that had always been her armor. But then, slowly, she walked into the room, sitting across from him at the table. She didn't look at him directly. Her gaze was focused on her hands, which were now tightly clasped together as though she were trying to hold herself together. "I got a letter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. "From my mom." James didn't say anything right away. He just sat there, waiting, allowing her the space to continue. He had seen the way she had avoided speaking about her mother. He had seen how the mention of her mother's name would send a ripple of discomfort through Mia's entire body. He knew this was something that went deeper than just an absent parent, it was a scar Mia had carried for years, one that had never fully healed. Mia looked up at him, her eyes bright but filled with something else, fear, maybe, or the beginnings of acceptance. "I don't know what to do with it," she continued. "I don't know if I should even open it. It's been so long, and she stopped herself, her throat tightening. "I don't know if I can forgive her. I don't know if I want to." James leaned forward, his gaze steady and gentle. "You don't have to forgive her," he said quietly. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But you do have to make the decision for yourself. You can't let her, or anyone else, dictate how you move forward." Mia stared at the letter, her fingers brushing over the edge of the envelope. James could see the internal battle raging within her. He knew she was afraid, not just of reopening old wounds, but of confronting the reality of what her mother had done. There was so much hurt there, so much anger and confusion, and he understood why she hadn't been ready to face it. "Why does it matter?" Mia finally whispered, her voice breaking. "Why should I care what she has to say now? Why should I let her back in?" James didn't have an easy answer for that. He didn't know what Mia's mother had done to her, or why she had abandoned her when Mia had needed her most. What he did know, though, was that Mia's journey wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about learning to live again, to find peace with her past, even if that meant facing the hardest parts of it. "Mia," he said gently, "this isn't about her. It's about you. It's about whether or not you're going to let her absence continue to define you. You don't have to reach out to her if you're not ready. But I think you need to decide whether or not you're going to keep carrying her ghost around with you. You've already been carrying it for so long. The question is, what are you going to do now?" For a long moment, Mia didn't say anything. She just sat there, looking at the letter in her hands, the silence stretching out between them like a thick fog. Finally, she took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling slowly. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she said softly, almost to herself. "But I think I need to know." James gave her a small nod, offering her the space to make the decision for herself. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. Mia's past would always be a part of her, and facing it would require more strength than she even realized. But he also knew that she wasn't the same girl who had walked into his life all those weeks ago. She had found the strength to start over, to reclaim a life that had seemed beyond her reach. And no matter what happened with her mother, Mia was finally starting to learn that she had the power to write her own story. As Mia sat there, holding the letter, James knew that the road ahead was still uncertain. The next steps were hers to take. But one thing was certain: whatever happened next, she wouldn't have to walk that road alone. He had promised her that. And as long as she was willing to try, he would be there, every step of the way. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly, the two of them sitting together in the small apartment, the weight of their unspoken thoughts filling the room. James didn't press her to open the letter. He knew that when Mia was ready, she would take that step on her own. Until then, all he could do was offer her the same thing he had been offering her from the very beginning: his presence, his support, and his unwavering belief in her. In that moment, James realized that Mia wasn't just learning how to live again. She was learning how to trust. How to believe that, even after all the pain, she was worthy of a second chance. And no matter how long it took, he would be there to help her claim it. Weeks passed, and while Mia's days were filled with the quiet rhythms of work and life in James's small apartment, there was always a quiet tension between the two. It wasn't the tension of conflict or anger, but the kind of tension that comes when a person is on the precipice of something life-changing. Mia was learning to breathe again, to live again, but beneath the surface, the trauma of her past still loomed like a shadow. She had made incredible progress, yes. She was able to work at the coffee shop, take care of herself in ways she hadn't been able to in a long time, and even start making small decisions about her future. But every time she glanced at the envelope, the letter from her mother, it felt like a wall she couldn't quite overcome. James had noticed the letter sitting untouched on the counter for days, then weeks, her eyes flicking toward it whenever she entered the room, only to look away just as quickly. He understood. There were wounds too deep to address all at once, scars that took years to form and would take just as long to heal. But what James didn't understand was how to help Mia take that final step. She had come so far, but there was still something holding her back, some fear, some anger that wasn't ready to be released. He couldn't force her to face her past, just as he couldn't make her forgive her mother or heal the pain she carried. All he could do was offer her a place to stand, a hand to hold when the world seemed too overwhelming. And so, as the weeks turned into months, James found himself in a quiet limbo, watching Mia grow but knowing that the most difficult part of her journey still lay ahead. The letter remained on the counter, always just within reach, always staring back at Mia. Every now and then, she would sit in the kitchen, her fingers hovering over it, but she never moved it. And in the evenings, as they sat together in the apartment, James could see the restlessness in her eyes. The peace she had fought so hard to create was still fragile, and he could feel the tension in her every movement. It was as if she was torn between what she had built here and what she had lost before. James's life, too, had been quietly transformed in the process. He had always been a cop, a protector, a fixer, someone who was used to seeing the worst of people and trying to clean up the mess. But in helping Mia, he had come face to face with his own doubts, his own limitations. He had seen the system fail people like her, and he had seen how difficult it was for someone to rebuild themselves from the wreckage of their past. He had always been proud of his job, but helping Mia had shown him a different side of the world, one where good intentions weren't enough to fix the damage done by years of neglect. But it had also taught him something else. It had reminded him of the importance of human connection, of the quiet power of simply being there for someone when they needed it the most. He had spent years fighting battles that seemed to matter little in the grand scheme of things. But helping Mia, seeing her wake up each day, seeing her fight to create a new life for herself, had reminded him that sometimes, the most important thing a person could do was show up. So he did. He kept showing up for Mia, even when she didn't know how to show up for herself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the apartment, Mia came into the living room. She had been gone for most of the day, working her shift at the coffee shop, and as she stepped inside, there was a noticeable change in her demeanor. James looked up from his book, sensing the shift. There was something different about her, something unspoken in the way she held herself, in the way she looked at him. He set his book down and stood as she walked toward him, her hands trembling slightly. He didn't say anything at first. He knew that when Mia was ready to talk, she would. "Mia?" James asked softly, his voice full of quiet concern. "Are you okay?" She nodded, but the movement was almost imperceptible. She took a deep breath, as though gathering her strength, and then sat down on the couch, patting the seat beside her for James to join her. He sat, watching her with a gentle gaze. "I think I'm ready," Mia said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've been running from this for so long, but I think it's time. I need to know." James's heart swelled in his chest. He had seen Mia come so far, but this moment felt different. This was the culmination of everything she had been through, the final step toward healing. "I'll be here with you," James said quietly. "Whenever you're ready." Mia took the letter from the counter, holding it in her hands as though it were a fragile piece of her soul, something that could shatter at any moment. She stared at it for a long time, her gaze fixed on the words she had never wanted to read, the ones that had haunted her for years. Her mother's handwriting. It felt like a ghost, a memory of everything Mia had lost. And for a moment, she thought about putting it down again, about walking away from it forever. But then she remembered the promise she had made to herself. She had to let go of the past. She had to choose to move forward, and that meant facing the parts of her story that still haunted her. With trembling hands, she tore open the envelope and unfolded the letter, reading the words her mother had written all those years ago. "Mia. I know I've let you down. I know I've failed you in ways that I can never make up for. I didn't know how to be the mother you needed, and I don't think I ever will. But I want you to know that I never stopped loving you, even when I couldn't be there. I don't know what happened to us, or why I couldn't protect you from the world, but I need you to understand that you were always in my heart. I hope one day you can forgive me for what I've done. I know I don't deserve it, but I hope you can find peace, whether or not I'm part of it. Love. Mom." Mia sat there for what felt like an eternity, the letter held tightly in her hands. She couldn't speak. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't know what to do with them. The words felt like a slap, like an apology too little, too late, but they were also a lifeline. Her mother had left her, abandoned her to the streets, but she hadn't forgotten her. There had been a mother's love in those words, a love that had been buried beneath years of pain and regret. James sat beside her, not saying a word, letting her process what she was reading, what she was feeling. He could see the turmoil in her eyes, the way her hands shook as she held the letter. He could see the pain of years of unanswered questions, the hurt of not knowing why her mother had walked away from her. Finally, Mia spoke, her voice broken. "I don't know what to do with this. I don't know if I can forgive her. I don't know if I can forget what she did." James gently placed a hand on hers. "You don't have to forgive her right now. You don't have to forget. But you have to choose for yourself what this means. You don't have to carry her absence anymore if you don't want to. You're allowed to let go of the pain, Mia. You deserve to be free of it." Mia looked up at him, her eyes filled with the kind of vulnerability she had never shown before. "But how do I do that? How do I let go of something that's been with me for so long?" James smiled softly, his voice warm and patient. "One step at a time. You don't have to have all the answers now. You don't have to know exactly what comes next. But the first step is realizing that you're allowed to choose. You're allowed to make peace with what happened. You're not defined by what your mother did or didn't do. You're defined by what you choose to become now." Mia took a deep breath and nodded slowly. She didn't have the answers, and maybe she never would, but in that moment, she realized that she didn't need them. She had spent so much of her life waiting for someone else to fix her, to give her the answers, but the truth was that she was the only one who could choose what her future would look like. And that choice wasn't tied to her mother, or her past. It was hers, and hers alone. For the first time in a long while, Mia felt a sense of peace. She wasn't whole yet, but she was on her way. And as she looked at James, the man who had stood by her through all the darkness, she realized that she wasn't alone anymore. She had found something she had lost long ago, hope. "I think I'm ready," she whispered, her voice full of quiet strength. "I think I'm ready to move forward." And in that moment, James knew that Mia had taken the first step toward her future, and nothing, not her past, not her pain, not even the ghosts that still haunted her, could take that away.